Great to see
Thanks for
you.
being here. So we wanted to start with just a few things from all of you that you wrote in. You guys wrote in a bunch of stuff, and we will be sharing it throughout this time. Just the response. The question was, what does Kamala Harris mean to you? And to your kids? What are the conversations you're having? How are you feeling? What are you seeing in relation to that in your home? So Landy writes, I have no words to articulate exactly what I feel, but as a mixed race Black woman myself, it goes deep for me. Joni, an adult, writes something that a bunch of people wrote about their kids, which is, she looks like me. Shauna writes, for my daughter and I, having a vice president and major party presidential candidate in Kamala Harris means that we are valued and witnessed. We are important, and our needs can be understood and taken into consideration for political change. Kim writes, my 4-year-old granddaughter is so excited to see a woman who looks like her running for president. Shantha writes, I feel an incredible sense of belonging and being represented on the main stage as a first-generation South Asian woman and mother. We heard from some teachers. A child in my art class asked me how to spell Kamala Harris, first woman president. It made me smile. Mamie writes, some of my students have been remarking Kamala looks like me with great joy. So those are just some of the things that you all wrote in.
Yeah, so let me start by actually asking you to respond not directly necessarily to those, but you both heard, again, as we say, you, Allison, perhaps particular, right, clinical practice, lots of contact with schools, with school-age kids. You know, when you think about, when you draw on all that experience and all that context, all those contacts you've made, I'm wondering what you're seeing, what you're hearing of how people are responding. One thing that's fair to say is that for a lot of people, her identity, one or more of her identities, really strikes a chord, and it's important, right? It's part of their experience of engaging in this campaign, this election campaign. So what are you seeing?
Well, first,
You.
it's good to be here in this space. Thank you for hosting this really important conversation. It's good to be here with my sister, friend, and colleague, and to see some names that I recognize in the chat as well, folks that I know that have children at the center of their work and world. And yeah, I love listening to those quotes. They're very resonant, and they reiterate the idea of the need for, windows and mirrors to be able to see oneself and to see what's possible. And it resonates with what I see as a clinician and as a person that spend times in schools. This is meaningful. It is salient to see what's possible for you, and to see oneself kind of represented is really, really meaningful. And then, as you all know, I'm a clinical psychologist that focuses on trauma. So I'm gonna get real depressing real quick, which is, it's really meaningful. It's really hopeful. I think we have a tendency to look towards that. And we also need to listen to how she's being treated and represented, because our children are bearing witness to that as well. So the misnaming, the misracing, the invisibilizing, the questioning, that too is also really resonant for people of color, for multiracial folks, for people who cannot be easily categorized. So I'm watching with both, hope and excitement, but, because I'm super depressive, I'm also watching for the ways in which we treat her are really meaningful, for how we make sense.
Dr. Joseph, what's your thinking?
Yeah, absolutely agreed. I think that it's for me, it's impossible to be able to enter into that moment of kind of celebration of likeness without thinking about the counter that Allison so beautifully named. The kind of base misogyny, the anti-Blackness, the ways in which she has had to, in response, actually not name the violence that's been coming towards her. And I think that teaches our children something as well. We understand this is an important political strategy in order to bring in as many potential voters as possible. And yet, there is something that stings about the ways in which she kind of winks and nods, but doesn't do the naming. And at the same time, I understand fully. I get it. I get it. But we see that tension. I think it's important to name that tension as well for kids.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, as you know, as she's been the first in so many moments in her life, and as the first woman of color to get this far and to be a real serious contender, yeah, she's a real provocation for a lot of people, right? And including for our kids. So she doesn't have to talk about it to be a provocation, right? Yeah, so totally agree. And we got a lot of comments like that as well about, you know, people having fear about what comes next, you know, like, is it a good thing if she wins or a bad, you know, depending on sort of repercussions and violence. A lot of people talking about their kids experiencing and themselves experiencing some of the just questioning of her identity, you know, just what is she? You know, I'm confused. You can't be both. And the, you know, the sort of the DEI hire. So a lot of that has come up where, you know, my kid is told he can't be Black because he's brown or light brown. You know, those kinds of things are coming up, and people are resonating with the difficulties that she's having as well, right?
So one thing I'm hearing, especially what Melissa just said, is whether she wins or loses, things will happen and some of it will be painful, right? You know, Allison, going back to what you said and actually what you both said, that there's some pain now in the way her identities are being treated. Right. One thing I'm wondering about, of course, we all know that it's a very, very close election. What I'm wondering is, when you think about, you know, people's investment, and especially the hope, the meaning, right? You said that they find in her identities, in that role she's playing. If she were to lose, some people will feel, and it may well be true, that she loses in part because of those identities, right? We had a couple of questions that relate to this from folks who wrote in. They're wondering, what should I say to my child who sees themselves in Kamala Harris and worries that if she loses because of the identities they share?
Yeah, I mean, as I think about that, I think about what stories we need to tell our children regardless of the outcome. You know, I think first we need to listen to how they're making sense of this. And I also think we need to frame this in the context of, like, we've been through this before. We have been through conversations about multiraciality before in the context of a presidency. And I hope we don't forget that we've been this is different, yes, gender, the type of racial makeup, the experiences, but we have this moment to not approach this as brand new, because this is an old conversation that we've had in the United States for a long time. So when I think about that, I think about, you know, to your question, we have a lot of stories that we need that are going to show up no matter what, win, lose, whatever happens, right? We know that, you know, winning will put her in a place of being able to solicit and take on a whole bunch of this kind of feedback and threat that our kids need to make sense of anyway. So I guess what I'm saying is, we have some stories to tell no matter how this turns out. And the stories are going to be relatively consistent with this continual, like, I'm confused by her identity. I don't know how to make sense of her identity, or her identity is why she's in the place or not. Like all the tropes that were really quite familiar. But I would like us to kind of think about, remember, we have been through conversations at this level about what multiraciality means. And it's in that context that I also want to think about and invite us to pay attention to whether or not we're tired, whether or not we have gotten worn down in this particular moment around race and DEI and like we are in a context. So it's an opportunity for us to think about, how do you feel now versus 2008? Were your kids around then? What does it mean if you've got teens, or like there's a bunch, but I've been in conversation with Ralina and really defer to her thinking about framing this. I think we need to pay attention to our cups. Are they full? Are they filled? Are we tired? Let's
We're
remember
tired, Allison.
been in that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Ralina, did you want to add to that?
Yeah. So I think what Allison is partially referring to is that the work, I have a forthcoming book that's called Moving Through Racial Exhaustion, and trying to name the moment that I date to. Certainly the idea of racial exhaustion is not a new one, but I date it to the election in 2016, and then that brought in a different level of racial exhaustion. I think that the moments of hope and change that we all experienced with Barack Obama, that's been tempered for this particular candidate. And so we have to figure out how do we continue to articulate our long fight with and for our children. How do we talk about the realities of racism and sexism in such a way that prepares them for the world, but this does not kill their spirits? And I think part of that is, the work that Alice and I do fundamentally starts with the concept of radical listening, of listening in deeply, even when it's uncomfortable, even when what we hear might grate against our own wishes and wants for ourselves and our children, and then figure out how to talk together to move forward. But I think that it feels like quite a different moment to me than in 2008, as we were dealing with and combating so much virulent racism against President Obama. This does feel different, not just because of the tone and tenor that is so much. It's a lot less coded. It's not just on the cover of the National Review, right? It's in all of the Trump's campaign rallies, and so we see clips of these circulating all the time that children, of course, are hearing in the background. And so how do we also name that while maintaining the wonderful moments that I was naming of windows and mirrors for our kids?
Thank you for that, Ralina. I think part of what you're saying as well, or what I feel about this and in our work, is that representation matters, but it's not enough, right? Like we really need to, in terms of preparing children in our lives, and all children, no matter how they're positioned racially or otherwise, we really need to help them make meaning, right? Because we did get a lot of comments from people who said either that their kids hadn't brought up Kamala's race, ethnicity, or that they hadn't spoken to their kids about it yet, and even that they didn't know how to, right, at various ages. And it does make me think of this, the doll test, right? Everyone knows about the doll test and how Anderson Cooper's folks redid the doll test some years ago. And I remember before that reading this amazing piece by Michelle Wallace, who was Faith Ringgold's daughter, and she's like a feminist theorist. And she talked about the doll test and about how what if the kids were answering we're understanding the question differently. Like they know what the right answer is. If you're asking me, who's beautiful, who has more money, who whatever, and you're Anderson Cooper's crew or some university folks sort of asking me, if you're only doing that, the kids might say, oh, well, I know who you think, I know what the right answer is. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I think I'm not beautiful, right? It could mean that, but it could also mean that I know, I see the patterns because I do, and I know who has more status. I know who's considered more beautiful. It doesn't mean that that's true in my house. It doesn't mean that's true in my head, right? And so the really important part is that I mean, a big important part is that to notice that kids are noticing the patterns, you know, with or without you. They see her. She is a provocation of sorts, right? Because she's not like the others, right? And we need to help kids. Representation is not enough. We have to do that, what you guys call radical listening. We really have to get on the floor with our kids and help them understand the meaning that they're making and, you know, help guide them where, you know, they're being led astray because there are a lot of very negative messages, as we talked about, right? So I wonder how, that's a lot, saying a lot, but I just wonder how, if we could talk a bit about how to have that conversation with kids, and if you want to add to why have the conversation with kids.
I mean, I think you just provided a great example of why, which is you're exactly right in that we don't know the meaning that kids make out of what they're seeing, but they're seeing a lot. So, you know, the story that I like to tell with this is that, for example, we're thinking about our kids and how to teach them to cross the road. And we have two options with that. We can do it to tell them to anticipate, this is a road, this is what we should do when we get there, this is how you can cross it. Or we can let other people teach them how to cross the road when they get to the intersection. So which would we prefer?
That's
And
good.
when we frame it in that way, then often parents will say, well, I'd like to tell my kids about the road first. And I actually don't know who the person is at the corner that might teach them to cross the intersection. So that's my invitation for us to think about not leaving this up to chance or to goodwill or to others, but rather for us to talk about the intersection. And I see that in the chat, some of the questions around how would we prepare, how do we engage? And that intersection and the why is that intersection is a road of racism and of meaning making or of stories that could tell many of the kids that we're talking about that they aren't beautiful or smart or capable or what they can and can't do. So we have this opportunity to, you know, get them ready, prepare them, engage with them, and to do that. And the science that you mentioned is actually really super interesting, which is we do have some evidence that for kids under the age of 10, that the complex task that you're talking about, which is projecting, I know what this interviewer wants me to say, is a really complex metacognitive task. And that issues of social desirability do impact that doll test, meaning that kids after the age of 10 are doing that logic of they want me to do this. Kids under the age of 10 aren't doing that so much. So it's giving us a little bit of window. The only way we knew that is because of active listening, of not just doing the tests, but interviewing the kids and listening to the kids and listening to what parents are telling us that kids are saying, asking the questions, what do you think it means? There's some beautiful work and great storytelling that's been done around how kids are really seeing and making sense of things around them, and that it could have a very negative impact. There's a lot of stories that I can kind of think of that they are listening to what's going on, and it's not hard to listen to or to breathe in the smog of negative messages around you and have that taint how you feel and think. And, you know, part of that storytelling is also Ralina and I had a chance to listen to kids talk about both the powerful things their agency, but also like we got a lot of negative stories out there as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
I wonder if I could, I want to push you a little bit, right, in keeping with some of the questions coming in. Yeah, so both the kids you may work with in your work, your professional work. Allison, we know that you're a mom. Maybe you're willing to share some of the kinds of conversations you're having. And of course, your kids will have had, right? You're doing a lot of scaffolding along the way. So it may be that the conversations you're having with your kids aren't the ones that, some of our listeners can have with same age kids because they don't have the scaffolding.
Mhm.
But Ralina, too, for your work, I'm wondering what are the kinds of things that you are saying in response to the meaning that kids are making? Ralina, can we start with you if you want to share?
Sure. Yeah. So my kids are big. My kids are 18 and 21. But my godkids, Allison's children are a bit younger. But I think that making meaning of race for us has always been natural because of the ways in which, as children have been, as they were little and naturally naming race, that we help them do that. And that race has always been a part of our language. So, reading in the chat for folks who are choosing not to talk about race, that's actually not the ways in which not only are you not preparing your child to go out into the world, the intersection, right? You're setting them up to get run over, honestly. But also as a parent, part of my job has been to try and be as honest and open about the ways in which I negotiate the world. And I negotiate the world as a racialized being, as all of us do, as white people do, because white people have racists as well. And so for us, naming and talking about how race functions, not silencing descriptors around race of talking about who is that kid? Oh, that white kid in my class, has been really important for them to then figure out all of the sophisticated ways to make their way through race.
Mhm.
Allison, thank you, Ralina. Allison, what are you saying?
Yeah, I mean, I've much like Relina, and in part, what we're also kind of talking about is what it means to be in community with each other. That to be in community with folks that can talk about it with each other and with each other's children. Relina's children talk to my kids, and that is a co-creation of their experience as well. But we've had a lot of conversation about race and racial identity. I would say that we have a fluency or at ease with race, and race is part of our identity because we practice it.
Mhm.
So because we've
Mhm.
got a fluency with it, doesn't necessarily mean that the cars aren't coming for you at the intersection. I'm gonna work this metaphor to death. It doesn't mean that the cars aren't coming for you.
It's got a
It
lot of
just
life left.
it just means that my kids know how to tell me and others that they can see those cars and they understand what
Mhm.
those cars are,
Mhm.
and how to get help for it. There's this tension that's very normal of protection. And I often hear from folks saying, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to give them the wrong idea. I don't want to teach them that the world is full of these cars, that desire to protect. And what we've learned by listening to kids is that preparation is actually the best way to protect them. And I'm saying this from what, Relina and I interviewed kids or actually had kids interview each other. And what they told us in many different ways was that preparation, knowing that there was a language that they could turn to understand what these cars were that were coming for them, did help to protect them. So that's, I think, an invitation that we'd like to make as people are holding on to that. I haven't talked to them. I don't know what to say. What if I get this wrong? What does that mean? My invitation is to think about your love and care and protection can be manifested through preparation.
Mhm.
Thank you so much.
And the con
Yeah.
So just a very
uh,
quick thing, there's a comment about what scaffolding means, because I use the term scaffolding, so forgive me for that. We just mean that, Allison and Relina are two people who started those conversations about race and identity and lots of things early, right? And familiarize their kids with sort of the language, the emotion, the the substance of race, right?
As we have with our kids.
As
Yeah.
we have with ours,
Yeah.
and of course, what you say to a 3-year-old is not what you say to a 13-year-old. There are different things you can say to your 13-year-old if you said something to them at 3, right? The kinds of things that are appropriate at 3 and at 5 and at 7. So the scaffolding is the building on, right? The sort of cumulative building so that you can have different kinds of conversations. If you haven't had that conversation explicitly with your 13-year-old, then it's very difficult, right? Or it's a different challenge that you face than people who have had that conversation. So that's what we mean by scaffolding.
Yeah, we also got a question about, how, I think it is just from what people are talking about with their kids, the comments we're getting, you read a few more, that for some people it's just more natural, right? Because they have experience, they've just had to think about race, and mixed race people. My inner mixed kid is excited to see someone of mixed background reach this level. My daughters are multiracial and they're inspired by Kamala, not just because of her racial and gender identities, but because of the cool, calm, and kind way she approaches people in the world. My 15-year-old daughter is excited about Kamala Harris's candidacy. My daughter is Black and Mexican, so she relates to her. And this one's great. Rohini writes in that one of her children's middle name is Kamala, named after her grandmother, who is Kamala, who was an amazing person, who survived partition in India and raised 7 kids in New Delhi and wrote books and did amazing things. And Rohini says, my children rejoiced with me when Kamala Harris became vice president, a woman and one who shared a family name and our culture. My kids recognize the extraordinary significance of her running for president, but they were born into Barack Obama's presidency. In their lives, it is unquestionable that a woman of color could be president. This is kind of amazing. So it's easier for some families, right? Where like literally your name's Kamala, so you sort of make the connection. We did get a question about folks who who are white, basically, and who don't share Kamala's gender identity, which to me would suggest they're not a woman. How do they talk about this, the provocation that is Kamala, about the fact that she's the first, and in some ways, and I think that that's how you talk about it, right? Like you say, she's previously, let's look at who the other presidents are. We can take out a book and what's similar about them, what's different. Sure, we had Barack Obama, and why is that? And we've been in our podcast, we had a great episode 6, season 1, with Marjorie Rhodes, about how kids tend to, especially younger kids, move towards individual explanations for things instead of systemic, just because of the sort of world, the culture that we live in that does that. And that if that in talking to kids in her work, their kids actually thought, oh, there's only been one Black president. I guess no other Black people wanted to be president, right? So these are all things that we sort of can talk about. We can talk about, gosh, I don't share her identities, but I think we're living in a more fair place if anyone can become president, or if you don't have to look a certain way, right? I want your world to be sort of full of different kinds of people, and I want people to not just look like us, who come to our home, who run our country, who run our businesses. There are definitely ways to talk about it, right? I wonder if you guys would jump on if there are other ways, or Andrew, how would you talk about it?
Please, Allison, what's your thinking?
My thinking is there isn't a wrong way. That's probably a lie. There's probably some bad stuff you can say. But I think the opportunity here is to think about what you think about what you want to convey, and think about speaking that out loud. I think Ralina made a really important point, which is our kids are watching us and watching how we are moving through our lives. They are watching how I move through in all my identities and making sense of that. So we are speaking to them about what this means to us. When they notice me attending to the TV in a particular way, or mentioning a name with reference in a way, they are making sense of that. So I think the invitation is for us to pay attention and to notice that, no matter what our identity is, it's happening. I think, again, as Relina said, like we are all racialized beings in this space. And just because we don't share the same name or racial makeup doesn't mean that we're not communicating, talking, teaching our kids about how to do race. So that's how I'm making sense of the kind of conversation.
And this is, by the way, a very basic point, but I want to lift it up. As we all know, there are lots of people with reference to kids who think that if kids don't name it, right, don't name race, that they're not thinking about it, they're not engaging. And of course, what you're saying and what we say all the time is, no, they are engaging, right? So, and as you said, right, the choice is, are you waiting for the person that they may meet at the corner to help them get across the street? Or are you taking that responsibility thoughtfully and deliberately and in an informed way? Ralina, what's your thinking?
Yeah, no, I thought that it was really interesting, Melissa, when you named this as a challenge for white people, as though white people don't have the responsibility to talk about race. I think that white parents with white children need to talk about their whiteness. And to name that early and often as well, and not just to not silence conversations about people of color, but to not silence conversations about their own whiteness. And I think that part of the challenge that we see with the racism that emerges is from the lack of those moments of fluency, right? So I would encourage all of the white parents who are here, white parents of white children, hopefully there are some of those here as well, to work through their own discomfort to have conversations all the time about race. And conversations about race are not always conversations about racism. I think that sometimes can be what those folks who don't have the conversations, who don't have the fluency that Allison named. Conversations about race are joyful conversations, and they're not necessarily always celebratory, but they're a part of who we are intimately and intricately, and so we need to name and talk them.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. We want to go to some questions. We've already incorporated some questions that people are asking, of course, into the conversation. But here's one. I'm going to tweak it slightly from the original, but it basically goes like this. You know, the campaign, of course, has featured a lot of really ugly rhetoric around immigration and immigrants. You know, of course, very prominently, the talk about Haitian immigrants in Springfield and whether or not they're eating people's pets, which we know is untrue, clearly untrue, and yet that chatter continues. Of course, we can, so the question is how to talk to our kids about this. Now, of course, we can say these things are untrue, but how do we talk? Here's the question. How do we talk about how and why it's so harmful?
You want to try it first, Relina?
I mean, I won't do it as well as you, Allison. But I mean, there are moments where we can kind of come in light and try and have a conversation, and there are moments when we need to call out bigotry and hatred in very clear and stark ways. And I think this is an example of when we can't kind of excuse something away. This is not a time for relativism or both sidesism. This is a time to say, this is blatantly wrong. We never talk about people this way. This is a lie. And these are the ways in which it's really harmful if we let this sentiment lie. What would you say, Allison?
Ditto. Yes. I think the piece that's really helpful about what Ralina is framing is that we have to do our own thinking about what we stand for and what we mean and what our values are. And telling lies doesn't typically resonate as a value. This information, if we're going to take this specific story, was not true. That's something little kids can understand, big kids hopefully understand.
Yeah.
And then we can also say, you know, these stories, this gossip really hurt people. And to be clear, and to also come to something I've talked about to this community a lot is our own mission statements, our value statements, to think about this conversation with a we. We don't hurt people that way. We don't talk about people that way. And to kind of come back to who it is that you want to be and who you want your kids to be. I understand that's complicated as we're watching big authorities do this. Why would grown-ups with power do this? Yeah, isn't that confusing? And sometimes people try to get power in this way. Do you notice that people, you know, it's equating and pulling this to your values as well. So I think the piece I really resonate so deeply with what Ralina has just framed is like, we get to say no. That's not right. Don't do that.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes in a sense of curiosity or gentleness with our kids, perhaps we forget that it's okay to call out and be like, nah, no.
Yeah. No. Nah to the nah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so a question here, a live question from the chat. For all her merits, I wonder if Kamala Harris would have gotten this far if she had a darker complexion. To what extent is colorism at play here? And also, why do people still say she is African American when in fact she is not? Now that's an interesting take. So anyone want to take that? I've heard her identify as African American with an Indian mother, right? And that's her prerogative. And I think growing up where she did, when she did, looking at her age, that was probably also, you know, that was probably the choice as well, you know. But we don't know.
She can certainly claim it, and she does.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's okay. Speaking as a mixed race person, like we can sort of name ourselves and then we get named as well, right? Which is happening to her a lot. But it is interesting, Allison, you were saying we've been here before. And we've been here before in this multi-raciality and you know, how the confusion that some people claimed that caused for them, and also just the idea that was, you know, that might have been an advantage as well for Obama, right? That there's still such a deep anti-Black strain, that we weren't going for blackity black.
Mhm.
You know?
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity and nuance in both, I guess, the question. And I mean, the piece where I kind of land is like, I'm not super compelled by confusion. I know it's something that I narrated before. I just, there's a person isn't confusing. It's you're making a choice to not to see them and how they identify. So just to say, like, my own exhaustion is, even as I narrated up front, it's not confusing. This isn't that hard. Listen to what a person says.
Yeah.
It's not, and what a great lesson for our kids to hear as well. And I think I am familiar in the context of multiraciality with how important it is to believe kids with what they say, and also the constant pushing and pulling and the ways in which other people feel like they want to define them. So perhaps that's my own form of racial exhaustion, which is I am not compelled by anyone's confusion. Because easy, listen to what the person says. And easy. We are complicated, multi-identity, racial folk. Just we could move away from that confusion by simply not making these a test. And what kind of test of authenticity gets passed where? Yeah, and of course this is complicated as one brings up colorism. Yeah, very complicated, very nuanced, changes over time. But I'll just land in the place and really want to hear what Ralina has to say. But like, I'm just gonna hold as a clinician, as a scholar, as a person that's in this space, as a therapist, and as a mother of multiracial kids, let's pause in the confusion. How about not? Just don't be confused. Just listen to what the person told you.
Really, I do want to come to you on that. And I want to throw in one other question that we got, which relates to it, right? So when you talk about, of course, we know that you have both and done together some research on multiracial kids. We have at Embrace Race, a significant share, we think, of our community that consists of, especially white moms of multiracial kids or kids of color, right? Whether because, anyway, there are obviously several ways that can happen and does happen. And we get this question a lot from them, which is, yeah, how do we respond to questions of race and gender identities when we ourselves don't share that race or that gender and or that gender identity? So just thinking about the kinds of things you've said already, yeah, how does that, as it were, mismatch, apparent mismatch, complicate the conversation between parent and child or adult and child? Ralina?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that one would make the assumption that you have to share every aspect of an identity with a child in order to have a conversation. I think that part of what we need to do is to put aside that assumption that the child is going to be like us. And we know that this is not true in a wide variety of ways. I mean, this is kind of part of where our radical listening comes in, that around racial issues, around gender issues, your desire for a child to be gendered a particular way might not be what the child is actually going to decide. So I think about, I don't know if you were thinking about this, Allison, we had these two examples, we had many examples, but the two white moms of multiracial African-American kids in our study who really kind of were just miles apart in terms of their levels of comfort and their own children's subsequent levels of comfort and kind of navigating themselves as racialized beings in the world. So we had this one white mom who literally had mama school, is what she called it, where she filled in the Black history that was absent during the week from school. So her kids, who at the time were in middle school, lamented, but also were kind of proud about all of the Black history that they knew and learned from their white mom, and who was a single mom as well. So we had her and these kids that were so proud of who they were and just spoke with each other and with their community in all kinds of amazing ways. And then we had this other mom, white mom of racial African-American boy who refused to speak race. And more than that, as he identified himself as Black, she said, no, you're not Black. And so over the course of the hour, we watched this child fall apart and ending up sobbing in the space as the mother said, no. So I think that, that shows you those are two incredible extremes. But I don't believe that racialized identity should dictate the ways in which you can and should be talking about race with your kids.
Well, let me follow up. So in fairness to this person and to many in our community who ask the same question, I don't think the question is should we have the conversation necessarily. It's how do we, in light of, right? Is it a different conversation you have if I'm Black and my child is Black versus if I'm not Black and my child is Black? And in particular, well, actually, I guess we don't know We do know
particulars.
from the way it was actually framed that the person's almost surely white.
Mm.
But Allison, what's your thinking?
Yeah, I think very similarly, like the how question I appreciate and hold empathy for. Because I try to find that there's a loving desire with which to do it. And the extremes that Ralina just held up that we heard were one person holding on to the best way to protect my kid is to not have them be Black.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that was a communication.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
The other extreme was a person who did not have the shared experience of what Blackness could mean, take on with humility and gumption and grace, attempt to do it, and may have messed it up, but did it. So I think that's the frames there, and is to hold on to the question of how.
Mhm.
Perhaps I often kind of jump to, often the question of how moves to I won't do it.
Mm.
So there's probably, with such a big community here, some folks that are asking how, which is I'm trying and I really want to do this right. What the research bears out, and I think Melissa, you spoke to this, is that the rates of people talking about race do differ according to racial identity, with the data indicating that white parents are speaking about it less. And even in the context of multiraciality, that fluency or that pressure, or what we heard was, on one side, the loving kind of hope, which is that parents, and we're talking about this in terms of white and Black, but there was a hope that we heard from the parents that we interviewed that their whiteness would protect their children from that street.
Mm.
And the more that they could perhaps lean into their proximity to whiteness or their children's proximity to whiteness, the more protected they would be. We can understand and hold empathy for that. And we heard children say that that meant something really different. And that in this case, and in a case that we see a lot, again, this kid fell apart crying in our interview. And we hear this in other places. And to think about, as we think about how multiraciality is being formed here with Vice President Harris, is another layer of not necessarily complexity, but multiracial identity that is different than the white-Black space. And perhaps that difference is showing up by some of the questions that we have around authenticity and what that multiraciality means. And I think it brings us, again, to a place of let's listen to how, let's do some listening. The how might be asking. The how, as a white parent, maybe we should ask. Kids, how do you think? What do you think? What would you like? What would you imagine? The humility and grace, and again, grace and gumption might be a way of leaning into it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that's great. And we have to, I love your radical listening and your, doing that at the center that you run, Ralina, and just the idea that we need to do more of that. There was someone told me that a psychologist, that they thought in general parents should speak 85% less. And that really like resonated with me, doing this work, is that people just like talk over and talk over and talk over, and the kids are like, oh, and my kids too, right? And I'm always like, oh, okay, the glazing, I need to ask another question in this moment, right? And a lot of this, there was Mark Hall was asking about, talking about his granddaughter in the chat here, and how he's white, she's African American, she thinks he's overprotective. Like, you can have so many conversations with that 11-year-old about, why do you think it has something to do with my race, and just like, she's got a lot of ideas about it. Is it because I look different? Are you treated differently? It just could really, and I'm sure it sounds like Mark is having those conversations, but it does feel like radical listening and sitting on the floor and asking is absolutely, and talking 85% less in my case, is absolutely the answer. So we're at the end of our time.
We are.
Yeah, that was quick, you guys. So wanted to just thank everyone who sort of made this happen, everyone who's here. Thank you so much to our special guests always, Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith, Dr. Ralina Joseph. I want to encourage people to listen to our podcast, which hopefully these guys will be on in a future season. We were excited that Tanya Mosley of Fresh Air put our first episode in her podcast feed today. So you guys should listen to that. Her podcast feed being Truth Be Told, and she has a name, so that's another one you guys should listen to. We really appreciate you. We hope to be having webinars sort of quarterly now instead of the weekly and more pace that we had back in the day, and doing more podcasting. So we hope you all are following us and will pay attention to that. And of course, find out more about these lovely guests on our website.
Great talking with you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. You guys are amazing.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.